Now, before we start this video, I just want to let you know I'm running with the 4K button on because it does kind of give a little bit of life to the SM7B. And without doing any post-processing, I kind of wanted just a little bit of extra life so it's not quite so muddy. While I was in Toronto for the summer, I was still working on videos, but I hadn't brought an interface with me. And because I needed loopback to do that work sometimes, I either needed to get an interface or I needed to download a dodgy app. So off I went to the music store. And when I got there, I almost swallowed my tongue. I found this, the SSL2 Plus for $200. This is an interface that launched at $280 and had a fantastic reception when it came out. Now, it was released at the very beginning of 2020, way before, well, you know. But it was also just before the big explosion of research and development that powered all of the prospective podcasters that were about to come out of the woodwork during the pandemic. Think about it. In January of 2020, the OG Rodecaster Pro was just about a year old, and even the third-gen Scarlett series was just a few months old. Things were just much simpler back then. No DSP, no 32-bit flow, just interfaces. And still to this day, some of the best options when starting out your home studio. But at the time when this was released, like I said before, this SSL2 Plus retailed for $279 and the SSL2 retailed for $229. And in the realm of interfaces, well, that isn't necessarily considered cheap. It's not expensive either, but even back then there was a ton of competition with pricing below that cost. But then who was this SSL company and where did they get off selling this for such a premium? Well, for the uninitiated, SSL or Solid State Logic has been one of the biggest players in the professional audio scene for decades. If you've ever been to an actual recording studio, chances are it was run with an SSL board. No, not that kind of board. Yeah, that kind of board. Since the 70s, SSL has been one of the most respected names in audio production. But up until 2020, they really hadn't dipped into the entry-level home recording market. They were still considered a console company. And when these launched, the SSL2 and SSL2 Plus, they came with some tasty specs, though rather limited on what they announced though, if you ask me. But at the top of that list, you had 24-bit, 192 kilohertz, 62 dB of gain, which was huge back then, and an EIN or self-noise of neg 130.5 dBu. Now, between that gain and that super quiet self-noise, this was a really impressive showing. Though that price was still a bit shocking. However, this thing does have a couple tricks up its sleeve. Dual headphone outs and RCA analog outs were the standouts here, the latter being sold as being perfect for DJs. It might be a bit dated now, but at the time, you didn't see these very often on entry-level interfaces. And of course, you had the MIDI in and out. Now, all those things I just mentioned only came on the $280 version of the interface. The SSL2 was just the same thing, but without all those add-ons. But for only $50 less, it seemed like this was a much better buy, even now. Now, of course, SSL also jumped on the bandwagon with their 4K button. This was much like Scarlett's Air button, which basically gives a bit of a boost in the highs, as well as adding a bit of harmonic distortion to the signal. So this is the SM7B with the 4K button off and gain set to about 3 o'clock on the SSL2 Plus. Now we have the 4K button enabled on the SSL2 Plus, and again, that gain is set at about 3 o'clock, and this is what it sounds like. Once again, this is the SM7B through the SSL2 Plus with the 4K or the legacy 4K button off. And one last time, this is the SM7B with the little legacy 4K button pressed, going through the SSL2 Plus. One last thing I want to test with the 4K button is how much noise is being added to the whole setup when you click it on. So let's do that. We're going to turn it off and we're going to gain up and then we're going to cycle through it to see if it adds any more gain, and I will gain up in post. So yeah, you can hear a little bit of extra noise, and that's with the boost in the high ends, and that's also kind of the SM7B as well being part of the system, but just keep that in mind when you're using that 4K button, that it does introduce just a touch more noise. Now, I will say it is a bit cheeky, but it is a nice touch. However, most people using these units to actually record music are probably just relying on post-production for that kind of stuff. However, as a counterpoint to that, as preamps have gotten better over the years and much more transparent, little touches like this do offer up the kind of character you might want to stand out. It was just a thought. Now, the last thing that made these units stand out was, well, the knobs. Anyone familiar with SSL had the immediate wow moment when seeing these controls. Now, it is very much an aesthetic throwback, but also, would it be an SSL interface without that red, blue, and black? It's just missing the green, by the way. So then, with all of this great stuff, how do we get here? 4 years later, and I'm buying this thing at a third the discount of the price almost. Well, I think this thing was just somewhat poorly timed at its release. Only a couple months after this thing dropped, COVID basically shut the world down. And while everyone was at home twiddling their thumbs, the world pivoted to podcast production as the main idea for audio production, and all the bells and whistles that went with it. Great specs were kind of swept aside for more channels. Basic DSP was becoming extremely popular for the masses who had no idea what a VST was. And great clean gain wasn't the selling feature that it would have been the year prior. And without getting enough of a foothold in the market, well, these things kind of just fell flat. Also, I do have to add, things like the lack of loopback functionality at launch did kind of make this thing less appealing to the uninitiated. Yes, SSL did eventually do a firmware update to allow it, but by that point, the world had already pivoted really hard. But now that we're in 2024 and at this new price, is this thing a possible workhorse for you now? Well, the gain at 62 dB is a bit low comparatively, but being as clean as it is with that super low EIN, well, I don't think it matters that much. 62 is still enough to drive an SM7B without any help from a preamp. Now, the list of things that didn't age too well on the SSL2 Plus and the SSL2 is relatively short. The meters are almost unusable today. Now, they weren't much better in 2020, but 10 dB steps, it's a bit too much. And the analog out, now I don't see it as being a negative, but I mean, it was part of the reason the price on this thing was higher. And I think the average person might see that as being a bit antiquated today. However, I think at this point, only $200 to get yourself a little piece of SSL history, that's pretty decent. This thing, much like most of SSL's lineup, will do you well for years to come. And I think this thing is now in the running to be my new testing rig. Maybe. Perhaps a video on that is in the works as well. Get subscribed so you don't miss that. What do you think, though? Let me know down below. Cheers, guys, and thanks for watching.